What is up, everybody? Welcome to the God's Heart, Your Part podcast. I am so excited that you are tuning in. Thank you so much. A couple quick things before we get into it. First off, if there are any specific things you want to hear talked about on the podcast, would you let us know? Reach out to us on Instagram at God's Heart, Your Part podcast. If you'd also like access to exclusive content, we got that for you on our Patreon, so check that out. It'll be well worth your time. Without further ado, let's dive in and let's learn from today's episode together. Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the God's Heart, Your Part podcast, where we are all about equipping and inspiring next generation leaders to be all that God has called them to be. I am joined once again for part 2 of this incredible interview with the one and only Meg Croyle. Meg, say hi.
Hey.
If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, it is on Spotify, it's on YouTube, so be sure to check that out because it was so rich and Meg had so many incredible things to share. We're talking all about faithfulness. What does it look like to be a leader who leads in a faithful way, whose life and ministry is defined by the ideal of faithfulness? And so, Meg, where we left off last time was we unpacked what is faithfulness and what does it look like, the importance of faithfulness within ministry, and how does faithfulness relate to faith. Now I have another question for you, which is this, and this is a bit of a pivot, and I think maybe we'll get a little bit, it's going to be some real talk, okay?
Okay.
There are times, and I'm sure you've had this, where you just flat out, everything within you does not feel like being faithful, whether it is to a ministry, to a friendship, to a schooling career, whatever it is, like that's real and that's human. How in the world do you choose faithfulness whenever your feelings tell you otherwise?
Yeah. And that is, I feel like that could be the wrestle of a lot of my life. Because like I mentioned in the last episode, I'm very much a victim of the instant gratification, thought process. Like I can get so easily discouraged and it's like one moment down the next. And, it is so easy for my first thought to be like, oh, well, I should just quit. I should just give up. It's not making much of a difference. Maybe it's a sign that I'm doing this wrong or, whatever.
Yeah.
And so what has kept me in those places when everything in me has felt like leaving that, is I go back to the last thing that God said to me. And I don't want to say that just flippantly and easy. And it's like, because I remember a time period in my life when if someone asked me that, I'd be like, I don't know the last thing like God said to me.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to like demystify it. It's not like he's like, okay, go, you're going to get this degree, go study for 5 years and at this college and do this and this. Like, and he totally can. He can speak however he wants to speak.
Yeah.
But often for me, he's speaking in more general, like he's interested in the person that I'm becoming and how I become more and more like Jesus. And so oftentimes when I'm making decisions, it's not, okay, he told me this very specific thing, though sometimes that is the case. But it's like, okay, the last time I was just still with him and in quiet time with him, like I felt like he impressed in my heart, like that we're in a season of health and that I'm supposed to be really intentional with those things. And so there have been decisions that I've made that have been like, I'm not stepping into something new because the last thing God told me was to just do well with things in my hand right now. And there have been seasons when I've wanted to give up that I'll go back and it's like, right. Like, but when I prayed, 3 years ago about school and I was asking all these things, I didn't feel peace when it was go into something to do with ministry, even though I knew I was going into ministry. It was like, I didn't feel peace to apply for a Christian college or university or whatever. And I sat and I waited and I missed all of the deadlines to apply to different places. And I had this experience with God and felt like he was telling me that there were skills that I would learn getting the degree that I had already told him I didn't want to get, that would be helpful to the thing that I was telling him I wanted to do. And I felt like he was just clicking things into place of like, okay, if you give me that, yes. And so I go back to the last yeses too, of like the last thing felt like the invitations that he offered me to take, and I went up on it. He is really good about tying up loose ends. So I don't see much in his character that's like, okay, here one day and gone the next and flippant. And so, at least in my life, whenever he's prepared a season to end or to change or to switch, and I've had so many experiences within leadership industry of roles changing and responsibilities and what it looks like in these different seasons. And I have always felt like God has given me a little bit of a heads up ahead of time, even if it's just a piece with, usually it's like confirmation right before something happens. That's like, oh, it could appear like, oh, maybe I'm not doing this right. Maybe I need to step out of this. Yeah. He'll have just given me like hey, remember this thing that I put inside of you? Remember this time that I told you that I was working in you in this space? And it's like, he gives me enough that I'll just still hold on. And I use this illustration in my own brain all the time to encourage myself. And it's so funny, but I just picture like me riding like a mechanical bull. And it's like, I'm just not letting go. It can thrash and it can move me and it can do whatever it wants to me. But the only thing I'm doing is I'm not letting go. And I think sometimes I get stubborn with God with that too. And I'm just like, okay, like if this is something that I need to give up on, if this is something that you had me here for a time and I'm supposed to step into the next thing, make me aware of that. But often I think the things that I get the most discouraged about are the things I know in my soul I'm supposed to do for the long haul. Wow. And it's the stuff that's shorter term. I don't tend to get as much discouragement surrounding those things. And not that those things aren't important, but I feel like it is the stuff that if you ask me to my core, I'm like the most tangible, real conversations I've had with God. I know that he said this, are always the things that in my day to day, I'm like, maybe I got this all wrong and maybe I need to give it up and maybe it's too hard and maybe it's not worth it. And maybe someone else could do it better. And all of those things, come in and it feels like I get into a wrestling match with God and he just goes, okay. And it's like, you have the choice to let go. Let me remind you of the things that had you holding on. And I'm like, can't let go of it now.
Like, come on.
I do. I think, cause he also gives us choice. I think all the time of, Moses and Joshua, and they had very similar stories. They directly, like Joshua learned from Moses so much of what he was doing. But I always think about the way their stories kind of shifted. And Moses does not get to go into the promised land. And Joshua ends up picking up that mantle and taking them into the promised land. And I have sat multiple times thinking, okay, Lord, like the things that I feel called to, like, this is a point where it would seem like it would make sense for me to give up. It would seem like this is the time. And I'll sit with him and I will often ask him, what do you want me to do? And I feel like more often than he gives me an answer, he asks me a question back. And I have felt this tangible sense of him stirring in me multiple times of like, do you still want to see it? And it's like, if you want a new assignment, I'll give you a new assignment. Like I think that there is a level of free will that he really does care what we have to say. And I don't think that it's healthy to have a begrudging, like, I mean, maybe for a season, but like prolonged. I think if you're not actually faith-filled about the thing that you're called to, you need to assess why. Like that's a heart problem. And I feel like he's always asked me, like, I will give you something different. Do you still want to see it? And every time I get this like giddy feeling of like, are you telling me I get to see it? If that's on the table, I'm picking that every time. If I get to see your goodness and faithfulness in the way that I believe you've told me I'm going to get to see it, I can't give up. Like, I want to see it come to pass. And I don't know if that's, I know that I tend to see things through a very faith lens. And so I'm very, if you can't tell, I'm very passionate. I'm like, this is my conviction, do it or die. Like it's very, it's very strong. But I think that there is kind of just a truth to that in general of the things that you are faithful to it's not a passing thought. It is an active daily commitment. And so you have to be passionate about it.
Yeah, man, that's so good. I have a couple thoughts and then a follow up. So I heard a pastor talk, because you've come back, you said it in episode 1, and now again, the idea of wrestling with God. And, I think that gets way too much of a negative connotation. I think that in the pastor that I listened to, I can't remember who it was, but he said, actually, there is no time that you are closer to God than when you wrestle with God, because it's impossible to be separated from somebody while wrestling with them. And I just thought, that's so simple, but so profound, right? Wrestling with God is not the same as denying God or running from God. If anything, it's clinging to him. It's holding on to the mechanical bull, like you said, right? It's like, hey, I don't know what's going on, but I know that I am going to hold on and not let go. And sometimes that is exactly what faith looks like and exactly what we're called to. So I just think that is so profound and so beautiful. A question I have for you based off of what you said, and this is kind of a softball, like, but also like, I almost don't want you to just take the super easy answer, right?
Okay.
And just kind of be real with it, because I do feel like this is a real question. Like, I just talked to somebody the other week who, and if they were to listen to this, they would say that is so great for Meg. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Meg knows what the Lord has called her to, and she can go back to her last yes. And she can, go back to these moments that God has spoken. But they were like, but I've never had that with God. I've never felt him leading me in a direction or speaking to me or communicating with me. For somebody who's listening in that camp, in that boat, because everything you gave is great once you're there, right? Once you have I've heard from God. How do you get there? And what does that look like because we say it all the time, right? Hear from God, pray about it, and ask the Lord, like, how?
Yeah. I'm really glad you slowed down the conversation to stop there, because that is so important. I'm remembering specifically a time when I was like 18. And I remember being like, God, I don't hear you. And I'm like, and I was mad, and I was just like, I keep asking you to speak and I don't hear you and I don't see what's going on. And I just, wow, I empathize with the people that are in that camp that are like, that's great for you. That's just not my reality right now, And I think, bear with my answer, if you're listening, because I feel like it might sound like the simple, but we're gonna go deeper.
Okay.
But I think I would push back a little bit and be like, has God truly not said anything to you? Mm-hmm. Because in my experience, he is so big and so wide, and he is filling every single day with just opportunities for you to acknowledge him and to see him, and kind of what we were saying earlier, like fixing your focus. And it's like, if you look for yellow cars, suddenly there's a million yellow cars, like if you look for red cars, there's a bunch of red cars. Like, part of it is what you're looking for. And so I would say, like, have you asked? Have you truly, like, have you asked, or have you complained that he doesn't talk to you without asking? And I'm not trying to come at you. I've been there. No,
that's good. That's good. Come on.
Yeah. And then there have been times that I have asked, and I haven't felt like there was a discernible answer. And it's just like, okay, I don't know what to do with that. But one of the things that I love about our God, and that I think sets him apart from other belief systems, other religions, is he invites you into the wrestling. Like, there is that intimate and active, he wants you to play a part. And so I always encourage, ask questions, so many questions. And I feel like I used to panic when I would ask questions, because I thought that meant I was doubting God. And so it was like, nope, stuff that down, shove it away. Don't think about that. And I remember having this realization one day of, if I treated my friends like that, I would have no friendships. Because the way you get to know someone is, hey, how are you? Where are you from? What's your favorite color? What do you do for work? What do you do? Like, it's question after question after question, because you're getting to know that person. It gives them a chance to respond. And I think that we don't give God the chance to respond. We don't the questions, or we're scared to ask the questions because it's like, what does that mean about my faith? What does that mean about what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I think embracing the questions, I think not being afraid to go to the hard places, and not being afraid to sit in the stillness of, okay, I asked and I'm sitting and I don't know that you gave me an answer.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in my life where I'll sit in my quiet time and I'll be like, I want to know about this. And I'll sit there, and I got nothing. And then I go about my day and I happen to have 3 conversations that day that talk about directly that thing. And it's like, oh, God is like speaking to me through my life and through the life that he's already given me, like as I'm moving through it. And so I don't know, I think it comes down, and this is hard. It comes down to trusting his character. And it's hard if you don't know his character yet. So I would say if you don't, ask him to reveal his character to you. Because he responds when we ask. Yeah. If you already know the character of God and you are a little bit more seasoned of a believer, and you know that God's real, you know, but it feels like maybe you're in a season where there's some silence, or you're in a season where it's like, I just don't, or just there are hard, confusing things. I've seen some of the best leaders in the world struggle with some of the most profound personal losses. And it's like, why? Why does that happen? And those are some of the questions that everyone struggles with around faith. And I think it really comes back to, okay, do I trust him more than what I can see of what he's doing? Wow. And when I look back, and I know this is like the typical answer that you're like, oh, when you look back on it. No, but that's good. There's so many times in the last like 5 years that in the moment, I'm like, why is this not happening faster? Why aren't you speaking to me? Why aren't you taking this thing away from me? Why aren't you like all of this? I know you could do it. Why aren't you doing it? Yeah. And I can look back and say, oh my goodness, am I so grateful that wasn't how he chose to do it. Yeah. Part of what I think about the hardship and the waiting and the just that feeling is you actually get to know Jesus more in those moments. Yeah. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, but the Bible tells us that Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. On the cross, that like he calls out like, my Father, why have you forsaken me? Like he has experienced the depth of feeling like God's not there. Yeah. And he empathizes. In Hebrews, it talks about like he's not just high up and knows these things in theory. He lived and experienced and has empathy for all of those struggles. Yeah. Because he lived a human life and experienced it in the same way. And so sometimes I think about the struggles that I'm going through, and it's like, my struggle is I'm not feeling God, and that hurts and that's sad and that makes me question things. And it's like, I feel like I'm not close to him. And then that feeling in itself is a really great starting point to be closer to the person of Jesus. Amen. Because we know that he walked through moments like that too. So I don't know. Was that helpful? Is there anything else?
I didn't feel like that was actually cookie cutter at all. I think the cookie cutter answer would have been pray more. Right. Like, fair. So I don't feel like you did that at all. I think that is so rich. And you've said this for years, right? And we've preached this for years. The idea that like when you can't understand God's hand, trust his heart. Right. So when you can't understand how God's maneuvering things, trust the character that he has, which is understood more fully over time. Right. Last thought that I have is you were talking about how it's oftentimes like, okay, Lord, speak. But I really do believe in this idea that like God's not going to give me part 2 if he's already given me part 1 and part 1 is undone. Right. So like be faithful and obedient with part 1 before you ask for part 2. And so I need to look back and say, okay, have I been obedient to what he's already said? Because it's annoying, right? If Meg asked me, or if I ask Meg, right, hey, Meg, how do I do this? And she explains something to me. I hang up and then I call her back 2 minutes later and I'm like, hey, what do I do, Meg? And she's like, I just told you that, do this. And I call you back 2 minutes later and I'm like, hey, Meg, how do I do this? But that's how a lot of us are with God, right? Like he gives it to us. And I think he's probably just saying like, hey, I already told you. Like,
Yeah.
come on, like I already gave it to you. You know what to do. And then we step into part two, and I was a communications major, so my brain goes here, where it's like back when broadcast TV first came out, it was all antenna based, and couples who had their new TVs would often bring them in, but they didn't know how to tune the antenna into the frequency of the station. And so what they would do is they would get angry at the television, thinking something was wrong with it, and they'd get frustrated without realizing, no, it's actually our tuning that is causing the issue. And I just think I've seen it in my life where if the tuning of my heart, if it's tuned to pride or ego or selfishness, I'm not picking up the frequencies of heaven because I've got my interests in mind and at heart, right? And so I love what you're sharing. I think that's all so good. How do you begin to hear the voice of God? Really check your motives and really check your history. Has God already told you, you know? So as you were saying that, those were two things that came to my mind, playing off of what you were saying. So I think that's so good. Okay, a couple more quick questions. For young leaders, right? They're hearing this, they're hearing you talk about, okay, you've heard from God, now be faithful with it. For young leaders, what are like some very, very simple and practical ways to cultivate a faithful heart? Break it down. 101, practical. Here's what you can do to develop a faithful heart.
I love that. Faithfulness is a fruit. It's like in the
good alliteration. Okay.
And I, even like as we're talking, my personality and I'm a very motivated, excited, let's go kind of a person.
Yeah.
But I also want to be clear with my words that this isn't like faithfulness is a to-do list or a stack. Like you have responsibilities, but there's a difference between the responsibilities and the faithfulness. And I think a large part of that is the tending to your soul and your spirit and saying like, hey, the fruit of the spirit comes from the spirit. Like you have to be rooted to have anything grow out of you. And so I think that the faithfulness, the first thing you can do is like, and I feel like I've said this so much, but I genuinely mean it. Dig in and like be ruthless about your personal time with God. Like if it has to be your commute to work and that's when you're talking to him. It's you're in between like sports practice and school and you have a little bit of time there and it's like, okay, I could talk to my friends or I could go for a 15-minute walk and I could pray. Like, you will, so sorry, my thoughts are scattered. Jesus is the perfect picture of a human leader. And the more time that we spend with him, the more that we become like him and it's natural, it's a byproduct. And like it says, that Joshua lingered, in the presence of God and he's like only mentioned like a handful of times before it's his whole book that's named after him and all of these wars are fought and battles won. And what we see about him is he was faithful, he was a servant, and he lingered in the presence of God. And so I would say don't be afraid to linger. And then also taking inspiration from that, I would say really, really practical is serve. And almost I wouldn't even necessarily be like you have to serve in a particular area or a place that you're naturally gifted at. And like, I mean, yeah, sure. Like go towards something that you might be more in line with like your giftings and how you're wired. But I would just start serving. And if possible, serving your local church, your local community, your family around you, your friends around you. Start with what's right here. In First Peter, it talks about shepherd the flock that is among you. And I love that because it's not saying like, it's saying like, start with who is here already, who is around you now. Like what have you already been given that you can steward well? And so I think start with, don't be afraid to start small because honestly, it's the small things that matter. And it's the big things that may or may not actually be remembered or have like these super great moments, but it's the consistency and it's the little things and it's saying like, okay, what's in my hand today? What can I apply to it? And I think God has a way of working. I've just seen this. I served in kids ministry for years on years, and I still love kids. Oh my gosh, they're the best.
Yeah.
But I think that in so many ways has taught me more and prepared me more for other areas of leadership and ministry. In the moments where you're like, okay, I'm just like trying to get a bunch of 2-year-olds to like listen enough that they can sit on the carpet. Like that's the only goal is like maybe they're not screaming their heads off, and maybe they get a Bible story in them if possible. But I've seen God like maneuver things, and it's like, okay, if he wants you in a different place, serving in a different way or doing something else, or he wants to elevate you to a position of leadership, like that's great. Yeah. He will do that. Yeah. But kind of like we were saying of starting with the last things he told you, there is a lot of principles in his word that he's told every believer. Yeah. And so it's like, I also don't even have to go out and look for a specific, it's like he said, go and make disciples of all nations. Yeah. And like, he said to live a life that brings glory to him, that people see him reflected through the life that you live. And so it's like, even down to like, he said, think, thoughts that are good, pure, lovely, and true. Like that's what's in the word. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, let me do well with what's here already. Let me be faithful in school, which like guilty. That is like one of the easiest ones for me to be like, yeah, I feel that. Ministry is much more fun and much more rewarding, and this is over here. But kind of just looking at all of it as like, this is the opportunity I have in my hand right now. Yeah. And I can multiply it, or I can hide it, and I can let it die. And those are the options. And so, if I have it, I'm going to multiply it, even if it's not the thing that I want it to be or what it looks like yet. Yeah. And I would say linger. I would say serve. And really don't be picky about how or when that looks like. Because God's heart is service. Leadership is service. If you want to be a leader, like think about that before you're like, it is not all Instagram followers and influence. Like there is a conviction in my heart that there are people that God has put on my heart that I can point them to him. I can give them a revelation that is unique through whatever means, whatever way of serving. And so taking this responsibility of like, I want to have people follow me. Like Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Yeah. That is a really bold statement to make. And you're signing up for living a life that you would actually want other people to imitate. And I think we're all way better at saying you should do this, but I'm gonna stay over here in my comfort zone and do what I want to do here. Like, don't ask me about my habits. Let me tell you about your habits. And so, I just think it's not a super light, fluffy thing. And even the best leaders that I've encountered in my life, they carry a lot of weight. They carry a lot of even just like the spiritual attacks that come on. Like there is an importance to it. There's a passion to it. There is a grace for it when you're called to it. But also, it is, you're in it for selfish gain, I don't think that you will last very long. Not even out of, oh, you have bad motives, but out of it won't sustain you. Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes back to even what we talked about last episode of just focus. Like if you can keep your focus on God, if you can keep your focus on what he's doing, if you can still yourself enough to hear him in the quiet moments, if you can have the faith to believe that he's working in your every single day, every decision, every conversation, the mundane things, the unseen things, just as much as he is in the big moments and the followings and I made it to this position in leadership, or X, Y, Z. I think that you'll cultivate a spirit of faithfulness.
Man, that is so good. You mentioned lingering. And we'll start to wrap up here, but I actually was just recording a solo episode for the Patreon. Hello. So if you want exclusive content, go over there. And I was unpacking the name God's Heart, Your Part. And I'm just explaining how a lot of times we focus so much on the your part, which is not bad, right? Like the develop the leader in you and get to know your strengths and your gifts, all really great. And I believe fully in that. But it goes hand in hand with the God's heart. First, to get the fuel and the passion to actually run your part, you need to just sit with God's heart and who he is and get to know him more. So that was really, really cool. You brought that up. And then you mentioned serve in any way. Meg, if that was a perfect answer to that question, what are practical ways to cultivate a faithful heart, a faithful heart in ministry and leadership? linger in the presence of God, and then start serving. Get out there, get reps in, right? Do it and serve in any capacity. Meg, finish the sentence. This is a test. If serving is beneath you, then
leadership is above you.
That's how you know you have done ministry for a while with somebody. Yes. So serving must never be beneath us. I think that's so good. Thank you, Meg. Any parting thoughts, any parting words that you want to leave with anybody?
I think
you've said so many amazing things. So if not, that's okay. But yeah, if you have anything.
Yeah. I think you wrapped it up really beautifully there. And I think, it comes down to so much more the God's heart over your part. Like your part is beautiful and unique. And like I said, like if you're the 17-year-old, just that feels like there's leadership that God has seen in you and called out in you. Don't minimize your part. But certainly don't minimize God's heart. Do so much more with a little bit of faithfulness, and it really doesn't come down to talent or skill, or like, I think that you will often see that God work through someone who has put the reps in, like you said, but it doesn't come down to anything that you can do, any education you can have or not have, or ability. Like the disciples were unschooled men that of like no importance, is like how it's worded, that they're like, they knew nothing. And people could tell that they'd been with Jesus because the stuff that they were speaking about was beyond them. So I would just say, like, you are getting into a life that is committed to the wrestle, that is committed to believing it's beyond me. And so I'm going to steward well my part. But I'm going to know that it's not coming from my effort, but it's from his heart.
Yeah. So good, Meg. Would you pray us out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Father God, Lord, I thank you so much for every single person that is listening to this. Father, I thank you, Lord, that you know every single person that clicks on, you know every single person that is listening, you know every single person that has a heart for leadership, that has a heart to see you more, and has a heart for other people to see you. And Lord, I just ask that you would do the work that a podcast could never do, that our conversations could never do, Lord, that on our own, we don't have that much to offer, but in combination with your spirit, that is everything that you could possibly need. And so, Lord, I just ask that for every leader, every person that is seeking and asking and wanting more, Lord, that you would just speak to them in a unique way, that you would remind them that you speak to them and they hear your voice. Meet them in the lingering place, meet them in the serving and the stepping outside of their comfort zones. And Lord, would you just remind them that it's not a call or a title or anything that they have picked up or placed on themselves, but that you look at them, that you have called them, that you have chosen them, and that it's by your spirit that you empower them. And so, Lord, I just thank you not only for good conversations and wisdom and the ability to just delight in your presence and good conversation about you, but Lord, I thank you that your spirit helps us to apply those things, that we go out of this knowing the next thing that you are putting on our heart to do, the next right yes to step into, the next place that we need to serve in, and the next place that we need to open our hands and just say, God, you can have control in that. So Lord, I just ask for a blessing over these leaders. Would we be faithful to multiply the things that you've put into our hands, Lord? Would we not be afraid and not bury them, but would we keep our focus on you, Lord, and continue to be faithful to the words that you have spoken? Father, I ask for all these things in your name by your power. Amen.
Amen. Meg, thank you. That was absolutely amazing. Guys, let us know what your thoughts were in the comments. If you agree with something or disagree, let us know. Meg, you're amazing. Thank you so much, friend. Thank you all for listening and tuning in to part 2 with Meg Croyle. We will be back next week with another amazing episode with an amazing guest, so be sure to tune in for that. Love you all so much. We'll see you next week. Later.